New York, winter of 1942. The FBI had intensified its counter-espionage operations after Pearl Harbor, monitoring suspicious transmissions across American territory. The German Abwehr maintained active operational cells along the East Coast, sending information about naval and military movements to Berlin, through codes they believed to be unbreakable. Otto Kramer's hands trembled almost imperceptibly over the transmitter keys. Across the Atlantic, Berlin awaited yet another report on the American convoys departing New York for England. The German naval engineer believed he had mastered every frequency, every code, every maneuver that could elude the FBI's watchful eyes. His partner, Ingrid Weiss, decoded messages with machine-like precision, convinced their cryptography was impenetrable. Both operated under the arrogant certainty that they were deceiving Washington. But the Nazi spies thought they were fooling Washington, until the FBI dismantled their New York network, had already been under surveillance for months. The intelligence game had begun, and they did not yet know they were the expendable pieces. The Brooklyn Heights apartment carried the acrid smell of cold tobacco, mixed with the metallic odor of transmission equipment. Otto Kramer adjusted his headphones for the third time that frigid January morning, his fingers gliding over the transmitter keys with the confidence of someone who had mastered this routine for months. Each dot and dash of Morse code left his fingertips with military precision, carrying vital information across the Atlantic toward the Abwehr command centers in Berlin. The metallic, rhythmic sound echoed through the small room, creating a symphony of espionage he believed to be inaudible to American ears. In that moment, Otto felt invincible, a ghost operating in the shadows of a nation he considered too naive to detect his presence. With every successful transmission, his confidence grew like a flame fed by his own arrogance. Ingrid Weiss remained bent over the adjacent table, her blonde hair pulled into a strict bun, as she decoded the messages received from Berlin during the night. The coarse carbon paper beneath her fingers left dark stains on her delicate hands, yet she worked with the focus of a watchmaker adjusting microscopic gears. Each symbol emerging from her translation represented a new mission, a new target, a new victory for the Reich she served with unwavering devotion. The apartment had become her personal sanctuary, a place where her cryptographic brilliance could flourish, far from the curious eyes of the American neighborhood. Ingrid had developed her own system of secondary codes, an additional layer of security she considered absolutely impenetrable. To her, every American walking the streets below was merely an unsuspecting civilian, incapable of grasping the sophistication of her intelligence work. Across town, in the Federal Building in Manhattan, Richard Callahan looked out from the 20th floor windows at the morning movement of New York's streets. The FBI special agent carried on his shoulders the responsibility of an operation that had been discreetly monitoring Nazi espionage activities on American soil for 4 months. His superiors in Washington entrusted him with dismantling a network they considered a serious threat to national security, especially after the attacks on Pearl Harbor had awakened an entire nation's paranoia. Callahan knew every move had to be calculated with surgical precision, because a single mistake could alert the spies and cause them to vanish into the city's shadows. The smell of strong coffee permeated his office, mingling with the scent of paper and ink from the hundreds of reports piling up on his desk. His tired eyes reflected not only sleepless nights, but also the constant pressure of staying one step ahead of adversaries trained by the German war machine. Otto and Ingrid's routine followed a meticulous pattern they believed to be both unpredictable and random. Every Tuesday and Friday, Otto walked down to the Brooklyn docks to observe naval movements, discreetly noting the types of vessels, departure times, and possible destinations of the military convoys. The sound of seagulls and the salty scent of the sea mingled with his intense concentration as he memorized every detail that might interest German strategists. His notes were made in a personal code that Ingrid would later transform into encrypted messages for transmission. During these moments at the docks, Otto felt directly connected to the German war effort, as if each American ship he watched were a potential target for the U-boats patrolling the Atlantic. The rough texture of the dock's concrete beneath his feet gave him a sense of solidity and purpose, reinforcing his conviction that he served a cause greater than his own existence. Ingrid, in turn, had established an apparently casual network of contacts who provided her with fragmented information about military movements and government decisions. Her natural beauty and European charm opened doors in social circles, where low-ranking military officers and government employees gathered for events. The clinking of champagne glasses during diplomatic receptions had become the soundtrack of her most delicate intelligence operations. She had mastered the art of casual conversation that extracted secrets without raising suspicion, turning every social gathering into an opportunity to collect strategic data. Her elegant dresses and French perfume perfectly masked her true identity, creating a social persona no one would ever associate with espionage. The silky fabric of her clothes stood in ironic contrast to the harshness of her nightly work, when she transformed fragments of conversation into detailed reports for the Nazi war machine. The confidence Otto and Ingrid placed in their own skills completely blinded them to the signs that they were being watched. Every transmission they believed secret, every code they thought unbreakable, every move they assumed unnoticed, had already been cataloged and analyzed by the FBI's technicians. The Brooklyn Heights apartment they saw as an impenetrable fortress had in fact become a showcase, where their activities were observed with the patience of scientists studying specimens in a lab. Richard Callahan and his team had turned the German spies' self-confidence into their greatest vulnerability, using against them the very arrogance that made them believe in the superiority of their methods. The Nazi espionage network in New York operated under the illusion of total control, unaware that every thread of that network had already been mapped by American hands, waiting for the perfect moment to pull and unravel the entire operation. Arrogance is the luxury no spy can afford, for it turns the hunter into the hunted. Richard Callahan walked through the corridors of the federal building with the determination of a man carrying secrets capable of altering the course of a war. His leather boots echoed across the polished marble floor, creating a steady rhythm that matched the organized flow of his thoughts about the complex counter-espionage operation he was coordinating. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the aroma of old documents hung in the air, creating an atmosphere steeped in bureaucracy and power. In his hands, he carried a brown leather folder containing photographs, transcripts of intercepted phone conversations, and detailed maps tracking Otto and Ingrid's movements over the past few weeks. Each page of that documentation represented a piece of the puzzle he was patiently assembling, waiting for the precise moment to reveal to the German spies that their game had ended before it even began. The rough texture of the folder's leather beneath his fingers gave him a sense of control and closeness to the conclusion of months of meticulous work. Callahan knew he was about to execute one of the most sophisticated counter-espionage operations ever carried out on American soil. The FBI operations room buzzed with discreet yet intense activity, where specialized technicians continuously monitored the radio frequencies used by the German spies. The distinct sound of Otto's transmissions echoed through headphones connected to state-of-the-art equipment, while American cryptographers decoded, in real time, each message he believed he was secretly sending to Berlin. The walls covered with maps, photographs, and connection diagrams transformed the space into a command center, rivaling any military installation of the era. Each technician worked with the concentration of a craftsman, knowing that a single mistake could jeopardize months of careful investigation. The smell of strong coffee and cigarettes blended with the metallic odor of the electronic equipment, creating an atmosphere heavy with controlled tension and absolute professionalism. Callahan's team had become a precision machine, capable of anticipating the German spies' moves hours, or even days, before they happened. Otto continued his regular visits to the Brooklyn docks, completely unaware that every step he took was shadowed by undercover agents who blended seamlessly into the port environment. Workers who appeared to be ordinary laborers watched discreetly as he jotted down details about the ships, their schedules, and their cargo, never suspecting that those men in greasy overalls and sun-bronzed faces were in fact highly trained federal agents. The sound of waves striking the hulls of ships and the cries of seagulls created a natural soundtrack that perfectly concealed the constant surveillance to which he was subjected. His notes, written in a personal code he considered ingenious and unbreakable, in fact followed patterns the American cryptographers had deciphered within weeks. The salty breeze carrying the scent of fish and ship diesel became, for Otto, an aroma linked to the success of his missions, unaware that each breath of that sea air brought him closer to his capture. The rough concrete of the dock beneath his feet had the same texture he would later feel in the cells of the federal prison, but that irony remained hidden in his near future. Ingrid maintained her social routine with the elegance of a consummate actress, attending events where she gathered fragments of information she deemed valuable to the German cause. Her seemingly casual conversations with military officers and government employees were followed word for word, through microphones discreetly installed by FBI technicians in strategic locations. The soft sound of orchestral music that accompanied these social gatherings had become the unintended soundtrack of American counter-espionage operations. Every sip of champagne she took, every charming laugh she offered her targets, every graceful movement of her gloved hands was recorded and analyzed by professionals who admired her technique even as they planned her downfall. The French perfume she wore left an aromatic trail that agents learned to recognize before they even saw her enter a room. Her silk dresses and understated jewelry created an image of sophistication that stood in stark contrast to the harsh reality of her situation, a spy being watched by enemies who knew every detail of her secret life. The transmission routine in the Brooklyn Heights apartment had become so predictable that Callahan could anticipate with surgical precision the exact moment Otto would switch on his equipment. The metallic sound of Morse code traveled not only across the Atlantic toward Berlin, but also simultaneously reached FBI facilities, where it was recorded, decoded, and analyzed before it even arrived at its intended destination. The irony of the situation completely escaped Otto and Ingrid. Their most secret messages were being read first by the very Americans they sought to deceive. The apartment they considered an inviolable sanctuary had, in fact, become an aquarium where every movement was observed through surveillance equipment installed in neighboring buildings. The smell of cold tobacco that Otto associated with the success of his operations had in fact become the characteristic scent of his own trap. The familiar texture of the transmitter keys beneath his fingers no longer represented a connection to German victory, but rather the instrument of his own condemnation, each transmission adding more evidence to the dossier that would seal his fate. Callahan knew the moment of capture was approaching, but his experience had taught him that patience was the most important virtue in the art of counter-espionage. Each additional day of observation provided more detailed information about the full structure of the German espionage network on American soil, allowing him to identify not only Otto and Ingrid, but also their contacts, financiers, and potential sleeper cells that could be activated in the future. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders grew in proportion to the closeness of the decisive moment, knowing that a hasty action could compromise national security operations far beyond the capture of 2 spies. His superiors in Washington awaited the green light to carry out an operation that would demonstrate to the world the efficiency of American counter-espionage. The leather folder he carried daily had become heavier not only from the growing volume of evidence, but also from the magnitude of the consequences each document represented for the future of the war and of American national security. In the art of intelligence warfare, victory belongs not to the cleverest but to the most patient. The march brought with it icy winds that cut through the streets of New York like sharp blades, and Otto Kramer felt an inexplicable unease growing in his chest as he walked along the Brooklyn docks. The familiar scent of salt and ship diesel no longer calmed his nerves as it had in previous months, and he began to notice details that had previously escaped his attention, faces that appeared too often, glances that seemed to follow him, coincidences too suspicious to ignore. His hands trembled slightly as he made his usual notes about the military convoys, and the rough texture of the paper between his fingers felt coarser than normal, as if even the inanimate objects conspired against his peace of mind. The sound of waves striking the ship hulls echoed in his ears with almost deafening intensity, creating a maritime symphony that amplified his growing paranoia. Otto tried to convince himself that the feeling was merely the product of months of accumulated stress from secret operations, but an inner voice whispered persistently that something fundamental had shifted in the delicate balance of his clandestine mission. Ingrid noticed the first subtle changes in the behavior of her social contacts during a cocktail party at the British Embassy, where American officers who once spoke freely now measured each word with suspicious care. The sound of crystal glasses clinking seemed sharper than usual, as if even the objects reflected the rising tension in the room. Her French perfumes could no longer mask the scent of distrust that saturated the conversations, and she noticed how her interlocutors averted their eyes more quickly, ended dialogues abruptly, and avoided topics they once discussed with ease. The silk of her navy blue dress brushed against her skin in a way that irritated her, as if every fiber of the fabric carried the static electricity of the suspicion surrounding her. Ingrid maintained the charming smile and elegant posture that had always defined her, but internally she felt as if she were walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. Her feminine intuition, sharpened by years of espionage training, caught almost imperceptible signs that the game had changed its rules without her being informed. Richard Callahan reviewed the daily surveillance reports with the restrained satisfaction of a strategist watching his pieces fall exactly into place. Undercover agents at the docks reported Otto's growing nervousness, while the microphones installed in the social environments Ingrid frequented captured her increasing difficulty in extracting information from sources that had once been cooperative. The smell of strong coffee in his office mingled with the aroma of paper and ink from the reports stacked in organized piles, each document representing another piece in building the case that would seal the German spy's fate. Callahan knew the crucial moment was approaching, when the accumulated psychological pressure would force Otto and Ingrid to make the fatal mistake that would allow their capture without compromising other ongoing counter-espionage operations. His experienced hands flipped through the pages of the dossiers with the dexterity of someone who fully mastered the art of strategic patience, knowing that every additional hour of waiting exponentially increased the chances of the operation's success. The smooth texture of the paper between his fingers contrasted with the roughness of the decisions he had to make, each choice carrying consequences that would extend far beyond the capture of two enemy agents. The Brooklyn Heights apartment became a cauldron of tension, where Otto and Ingrid tried to maintain their normal routine, while grappling with the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. The nightly transmissions to Berlin continued on schedule, but now they were marked by longer pauses and hesitations that revealed doubts, once non-existent, about the security of their communications. The metallic sound of Morse code echoed in the small space with a different quality, as if the radio waves themselves carried the weight of the suspicion tormenting them. Ingrid decoded the messages received with the same technical precision as always, but her bright eyes now reflected a concern she tried to hide from Otto and from herself. The smell of cold tobacco that clung to the apartment seemed sharper, more suffocating, turning what had once been a sanctuary into a claustrophobic environment that amplified every suspicious noise from the street. They began whispering about the possibility of moving apartments, changing transmission schedules, or even requesting an emergency exfiltration to Berlin. The fatal decision came in the form of an unscheduled transmission that Otto decided to send in a moment of mounting desperation, breaking established protocols in his urge to communicate his suspicions to his superiors in Berlin. The sound of the transmitter keys pressed with excessive urgency created a Morse code pattern that betrayed the operator's altered emotional state, something the American technicians immediately recognized as a sign of imminent breakdown. Callahan received the call at his home at 3 in the morning, informing him that the German spies had broken their own security protocols and requested emergency instructions to abandon the operation. The cold texture of the phone in his hand contrasted with the warmth of adrenaline coursing through his veins, for he knew this was the moment he had been patiently waiting for during months of meticulous investigation. The smell of freshly brewed coffee in his kitchen, mixed with the aroma of victory that finally materialized after so many months of tireless work. Ingrid and Otto had just signed their own sentences by publicly demonstrating, over the radio waves, that they knew they were under surveillance. Berlin's response arrived the next morning, confirming Callahan's worst fears. The Abwehr ordered the immediate evacuation of its agents in New York, setting a 48-hour deadline to abandon all operations and reach an extraction point on the New Jersey coast. Otto and Ingrid received detailed instructions for emergency procedures that included destroying all equipment and documents, erasing any trace of their presence in the apartment, and activating false identities prepared specifically for critical situations like this one. The Brooklyn Heights apartment became a scene of frantic activity, where two trained professionals tried to erase months of clandestine life in a matter of hours. The smell of burning paper began to permeate the air, as they systematically destroyed every document that could compromise future German intelligence operations. The cruel irony of the situation completely escaped them. Every move of their desperate escape was being observed and recorded by the very Americans they believed they were leaving behind. Desperation turns seasoned spies into amateurs, and amateurs always make fatal mistakes. The early hours of March 15, 1943 brought a dense fog that wrapped New York like an icy shroud, and Otto Kramer knew these would be his final hours on American soil. The Brooklyn Heights apartment that had served for so many months as the command center of his secret operation had now become a scene of controlled destruction, where every object was methodically eliminated or readied for permanent abandonment. The acrid smell of burning paper mingled with the metallic odor of transmission equipment being dismantled, creating an atmosphere that breathed end-of-era finality and defeat disguised as strategic withdrawal. His hands, once operating the transmitter keys with absolute confidence, now trembled slightly as he disconnected wires and packed components into special cases prepared for emergencies. The cold texture of the metal he touched seemed to drain the warmth from his fingers, as if the objects themselves conspired to make the moment even darker. Otto tried to maintain the professional composure that defined him, but every noise from the street below made his heart race with the expectation that American agents could appear at any moment to halt his desperate escape. Ingrid Weiss worked with mechanical efficiency, destroying the codes and documents that represented months of meticulous labor, but her blue eyes reflected a melancholy she could not entirely conceal. The sound of pages being torn and fed into the flames in the apartment's small fireplace created a macabre soundtrack for the end of an operation she had considered her masterpiece in infiltration and intelligence gathering. Each code she cast into the fire represented not only the destruction of valuable information, but also the end of an identity carefully constructed over years of preparation. The French perfume she wore for social engagement still clung to her clothes, but now it felt inappropriate, even absurd, against the stark reality of her situation. The silk of her dress brushed her skin with a softness that stood in ironic contrast to the harshness of the circumstances, forcing her to abandon an entire life built on sophisticated lies. Ingrid knew she was about to leave behind not just a mission, but an entire existence that had become more real to her than her original German identity. Across town, Richard Callahan coordinated the final operation with the precision of a conductor leading a complex symphony where every agent, every vehicle, every movement had been choreographed to culminate in the perfect capture of the German spies. The smell of strong coffee in his operations room mingled with the aura of controlled tension emanating from his team, everyone aware that this moment represented the apex of months of tireless work and strategic patience. His experienced hands leafed through detailed maps showing the route Otto and Ingrid would take toward the extraction point in New Jersey, each possible path marked with color codes indicating undercover positions and alternate interception points. The smooth paper of the maps contrasted with the roughness of the decisions he had to make, knowing that a single miscalculation could allow the spies to slip away and compromise years of counter-espionage work. Callahan felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but also a deep satisfaction, knowing he was about to execute one of the most sophisticated operations in FBI history. Each passing second drew him closer to the vindication of his strategy of patience and meticulous observation. The taxi Otto and Ingrid hailed in the frigid pre-dawn carried them through New York's deserted streets toward what they believed was freedom, when in reality, it was delivering them to the heart of the most elaborate trap the FBI had ever prepared on American soil. The sound of the engine and the tires on wet asphalt created a monotonous soundtrack that amplified the silent tension between the two German spies. Ingrid clutched a small case containing the last undestroyed codes and false identity documents, while Otto checked his watch obsessively, calculating the minutes remaining until they reached the rendezvous point with the German submarine that would return them to Europe. The smell of worn leather from the back seat mixed with the scent of rain, seeping through the window seams, forging an atmosphere that breathed end of journey and uncertainty about the future. The rough fabric of the seats scraped against their clothes, a constant reminder that they were in strangers' hands, dependent on luck and on the efficiency of an organization operating thousands of miles away. They did not know the taxi driver was an undercover federal agent taking them not to salvation, but to the final act of an operation that would turn hunters into prey. The abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn's industrial district, meant to serve as the final stop before the trip to New Jersey, proved the perfect stage for the culmination of German arrogance versus American patience. Otto and Ingrid stepped out of the taxi with the confidence of those who believed they had bested every obstacle, only to be met by the sight of dozens of federal agents strategically positioned around the building, transforming their planned escape into a cinematic capture. The sound of their own breathing echoed in the frigid air, amplified by the absolute silence that preceded the moment when Richard Callahan emerged from the shadows with a smile that blended professional satisfaction and respect for a defeated adversary. The cold metal of the handcuffs that would soon encircle their wrists was not yet felt, but the scent of defeat already hung in the air around them like a bitter perfume announcing the end of an era. Ingrid let the case of final secrets fall. The thud of leather on the concrete floor echoed like a gavel, sealing the verdict of an operation that had ended before it even began. The fog that blanketed New York that morning also enshrouded German dreams of espionage superiority, revealing that true mastery belonged to those who could turn an enemy's confidence into his own trap. Otto and Ingrid's last moments of freedom dissolved like smoke in the icy air, as they realized that every movement of the previous months had been observed, catalogued, and anticipated by a superior intelligence that turned their confidence into a fatal vulnerability. The Brooklyn warehouse, supposed to be the first step to salvation, became the scene of a devastating revelation. They had never been the masters of the espionage game they believed they controlled. Richard Callahan approached with measured steps, carrying a leather folder identical to Otto's, but filled with photographs, transcripts, and evidence documenting every second of their secret lives over the last 6 months. The smell of paper and ink emanating from that dossier represented not only the end of an operation, but the irrefutable proof that German arrogance had been systematically dismantled by American patience and precision. The coarse texture of the concrete underfoot would become familiar in the years to come, when they discovered that the floors of American federal prisons had the same roughness as the ground on which they were captured that historic dawn, a moment that sealed the fate of a network of spies that believed itself invincible. When spies discover they've been spied upon, they finally understand that in the art of intelligence, there is no permanent superiority, only temporary victories that an adversary's patience can turn into definitive defeats. The interrogation room at the Manhattan Federal Building exuded the characteristic smell of disinfectant mixed with the heavy aroma of decades of confessions wrested from within those painted concrete walls. Otto Kramer sat in a metal chair that squeaked with every movement, his handcuffed wrists resting on a stainless steel table that reflected the fluorescent lights above like cruel mirrors, multiplying his image of defeat. The constant hum of the air conditioner created a mechanical soundtrack that amplified the tense silence between him and Richard Callahan, who methodically organized stacks of documents with the patience of a librarian cataloging rare volumes. The smooth, cold surface of the table beneath his cuffed hands stood in ironic contrast to the heat of humiliation swelling in his chest as he stared at photographs of himself at the Brooklyn docks, completely oblivious to the surveillance that had documented every step of his secret missions. Otto was still trying to process the magnitude of the American operation that had transformed his professional confidence into an intricate trap, where every transmission he thought secret had in fact served as additional evidence against him. The bare walls seemed to close in like the sides of a coffin, burying for good his career as an elite German intelligence officer. Richard Callahan slowly opened the first folder, revealing complete transcripts of every phone conversation Otto had held over the past 4 months, including calls he believed impossible to intercept because of the verbal codes he used. The sound of pages turning echoed through the room like a countdown to total humiliation, as Callahan read aloud passages that displayed intimate knowledge of details Otto considered absolutely confidential. The smell of paper and ink from the transcripts mixed with the metallic tang of cold sweat beginning to soak the German spy's clothes, creating an atmosphere that breathed defeat and total exposure. Each word the American agent read was like a blade slicing through the illusions of superiority Otto had cultivated during months of seemingly successful operations. The rough carbon copy paper between Callahan's fingers produced an almost inaudible rasp that only amplified Otto's growing silence as he began to grasp the true extent of his vulnerability. The photographs spread across the table showed not only his public movements, but also intimate moments inside the Brooklyn Heights apartment, proof that his private life had been laid bare with the surgical precision of an autopsy. The most devastating revelation came when Callahan presented recordings of Otto's own transmissions, decoded and translated by American cryptographers before they even reached Berlin. In an identical room 3 floors above, Ingrid Weiss faced her own session of shattering revelations, as a federal agent presented photographic evidence of every social event she had attended over the past 6 months. The soft rustle of turning pages contrasted with the brutal impact of images documenting conversations she had believed private and secure, now showing microphones discreetly positioned in places she considered impossible to monitor. The scent of her French perfume, still clinging to her clothes even after the traumatic night of capture, now seemed ridiculous and out of place against the stark reality of her exposure. Each photograph revealed not only her presence at events but also close-ups of her facial expressions during specific conversations, demonstrating that every micro-expression had been cataloged and analyzed by professionals who knew her technique better than she did. The silky navy dress rasped softly against the metal chair, a nearly imperceptible sound that heightened her growing awareness of total vulnerability. Recordings of her most intimate conversations with American officers echoed from strategically placed speakers, creating a ghostly chorus of her own voice, seducing men who had known exactly who she was from the very first meeting. The federal agent, a middle-aged woman whose eyes reflected absolute professionalism, calmly explained how each piece of information Ingrid believed she had extracted had actually been carefully planted to test the efficiency of her transmission network. Otto learned that his personal code, so ingenious and unbreakable, had been solved by American cryptographers within 3 weeks of the first intercepted samples. He became aware of his own breathing in the silent room, as Callahan demonstrated how simple mathematical patterns in his notes revealed not only the content of the messages, but also personality traces that allowed the Americans to anticipate his reactions in particular situations. The smell of coffee that Callahan sipped throughout the evidentiary presentation mingled with the acrid scent of nervous sweat beginning to permeate Otto's clothes, creating an atmosphere that breathed the inevitability of confession. The rough paper of the decoded notes contrasted with the soft, creeping sense of defeat settling in his mind as he realized his entire career as a spy had been built on illusions of competence that American reality had systematically dismantled. The pages of broken codes lay scattered across the table like autumn leaves, each one representing a different facet of his professional persona that had been dissected and understood by adversaries demonstrating absolute technical superiority. With calm, professor-like clarity, Callahan explained how mathematical algorithms developed specifically to break German codes had turned Otto's most secret transmissions into open books read in Washington before they reached Berlin. The most humiliating moment came when Otto realized some of his dispatches had been intercepted, altered, and retransmitted to Berlin with false information, unwittingly making him a double agent undermining his own cause. Ingrid, for her part, faced the devastating revelation that her most valuable social contacts were in fact double agents working directly for the FBI, feeding her false information while extracting operational details about German intelligence methods. The sound of recordings of her own conversations echoed in the room like ghosts of lost confidence, as the federal agent demonstrated how every relationship Ingrid had carefully cultivated had been orchestrated by the Americans from the very first encounter. The smell of disinfectant in the room mingled with the residual aroma of champagne still lodged in her memory, creating a cruel contrast between the sophistication of her former social life and the brutality of her current condition. The chair's cold metal against her back reminded her constantly that she was trapped not only physically, but psychologically, ensnared in a web spun around her with the patience of an experienced spider. Every name she had reported to Berlin was in fact an innocent civilian or an undercover American agent. meaning no genuinely valuable information had been transmitted during months of meticulous work. The photographs of social events took on a sinister dimension, as the agent explained how entire scenes had been staged specifically for Ingrid, with professional actors playing roles as military officers and government officials who had never truly existed. The bitterest discovery came as she realized that her own beauty and charm, powers she had long considered decisive in her arsenal, had been anticipated and neutralized by professionals versed in seduction techniques far more sophisticated than her own. Afternoon turned to night as the interrogations ground on, layer after layer revealing a counter-espionage operation that surpassed in complexity and sophistication anything the German Abwehr could have conceived in its best days. Otto and Ingrid, separated in different rooms yet facing equally devastating disclosures, began to understand that they had been sacrificial pieces in a much larger game, their capture merely the final move in a match the Americans had played with absolute patience. The hum of the air conditioning fans became hypnotic, a mechanical soundtrack to the systematic dismantling of everything they believed about espionage, professional competence, and German technical superiority. The cold bite of the handcuffs around their wrists had become familiar. As if their bodies were physically adapting to the prisoner status their minds still resisted fully accepting. The revelations would continue for days, each new piece of evidence adding more weight to the dossier that would seal not only their individual fates, but also send Berlin a clear message about the true capacity of American counter-espionage on its own soil. A spy's true defeat doesn't occur at the moment of capture, but when he discovers he was never as competent as he believed. The winter of 1943 took its leave of New York with gusts of icy wind that cut through the streets like sharp blades, while in the corridors of the Federal Building, the consequences of Operation Countertide unfolded in waves that would reach Berlin, Washington, and every intelligence center in a world at war. Richard Callahan walked those halls with the restrained satisfaction of a man who had carried out one of the most sophisticated operations in counter-espionage history, but he also bore the weight of turning a tactical victory into a lasting strategic advantage. The smell of strong coffee wafting from his office mingled with the aroma of classified documents piling up on his desk, each page representing a new offshoot of the German spy network exposed through the capture of Otto and Ingrid. His seasoned hands flipped through reports detailing international connections uncovered in the interrogations, revealing that the German pair were only the tip of an iceberg of operations spanning the entire American continent. The rough texture of the maps he consulted daily showed red markings indicating espionage cells identified in Canada, Mexico, and Argentina, each tied in some way to the New York network, dismantled with surgical precision. The constant ringing of phones in his department created a soundtrack of controlled urgency, as agents from other countries requested information on techniques they could apply on their own soil to uncover similar networks. Callahan knew his operation's success had set a new standard for modern intelligence warfare, where strategic patience outmatched impulsive action. In the cells of the Manhattan Federal Prison, Otto Kramer faced the brutal reality of his new condition through the steel bars that filtered the gray light of the American winter. The metallic slam of locking doors echoed constantly down the corridors, creating a confinement soundtrack that had forever replaced the familiar music of radio transmissions that had defined his professional identity for years. The smell of industrial disinfectant saturated the air of his cell, mixing with the odor of damp concrete and rusted metal, scents that would dominate his existence over the next 20 years behind bars. His hands, once operating sophisticated communications equipment with the dexterity of a virtuoso pianist, now touched only the cold walls of his cell, feeling the rough texture of the concrete that constantly reminded him of the solidity of his defeat. Otto spent hours trying to mentally reconstruct every moment of his secret operation, searching for the fatal mistake that had allowed the Americans to detect him, but he gradually came to understand there had been no single error. Only the absolute technical and strategic superiority of an adversary he had underestimated. The letters from Berlin stopped arriving after his third month in prison, signaling that the Abwehr had officially abandoned its captured agents to protect future operations, a reality Otto faced with the bitterness of someone who had discovered that loyalty in espionage is always conditional. During long, sleepless nights, he listened to the distant sounds of New York traffic, And imagine the radio waves still coursing through the city, carrying secrets and lies between adversaries who would never stop trying to outdo one another in the deadly art of military intelligence. Ingrid Weiss adapted to the women's prison with the same disciplined elegance that had marked her life as a spy, transforming her cell into an organized space where every object had a specific function and a set place. The sound of women's voices echoing down the corridors created an atmosphere different from the military rigidity she had known through years of training in Germany, but just as restrictive in terms of personal freedom and freedom of movement. Her delicate hands, which once handled secret codes and confidential documents, now performed simple manual tasks assigned by prison administration as part of her forced rehabilitation routine. The smell of industrial soap and canned food had replaced the French perfumes and champagne of the social events where she had gathered information for the German cause, creating an olfactory reality that constantly reminded her of the distance between her glamorous past and her institutionalized present. The rough texture of prison uniforms brushed her skin, as a constant reminder that the carefully constructed identity she had worn had been dissolved by American authorities who knew every detail of her false persona. Ingrid found that other inmates regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, as rumors about her identity as a German spy circulated through the corridors, creating an aura of mystery she could neither confirm nor deny due to security restrictions. In her sessions of solitary reflection, she began questioning not only the effectiveness of her operational methods, but also the legitimacy of the cause for which she had sacrificed years of her life, and ultimately, her freedom. J. Edgar Hoover's office in Washington buzzed with intense activity as the FBI director received detailed reports on the international implications of Operation Countertide and its consequences for global intelligence warfare. The clatter of typewriters echoed constantly in the adjacent halls, producing documents that would be distributed to allies and analyzed for decades as an example of effective wartime counter-espionage. The smell of Cuban cigars Hoover smoked during strategy meetings mingled with the aroma of carbon paper and ink that permeated all the classified documents circulating through his department, creating an atmosphere suffused with power and control over information vital to national security. His hands, well practiced in political maneuvering, leafed through dossiers revealing links between the New York network and similar operations in Europe, demonstrating that the capture of Otto and Ingrid had yielded valuable intelligence on German operational methods at a global scale. The smooth finish of the bound reports contrasted with the roughness of the decisions he had to make about how to use the information obtained, without compromising sources and methods that could prove useful in future operations. Hoover understood that Callahan's success had established the FBI as a dominant force in international counter-espionage, a position he intended to leverage politically to expand his organization's influence in the post-war era. The photographs of Otto and Ingrid in custody would become propaganda symbols, demonstrating American effectiveness in protecting the homeland from enemy infiltration, a message broadcast through newspapers and newsreels to bolster domestic morale and discourage future espionage attempts on American soil. Berlin received news of the New York network's capture through intelligence channels that confirmed the Abwehr's worst fears about vulnerabilities in its American operations. The wail of air raid sirens that dominated the bombed city provided an apocalyptic soundtrack to discussions of how the loss of Otto and Ingrid had compromised not only specific operations, but also the overall credibility of German intelligence in enemy territory. The ever-present smell of smoke and rubble in Berlin, mixed with the odor of burning paper, as documents were destroyed to prevent further information from falling into American hands should the war continue to deteriorate for the Reich. The trembling hands of intelligence officers flipped through fragmentary reports, arriving via neutral diplomatic channels, revealing devastating details of how German methods had been anticipated and neutralized by superior American techniques. The rough texture of the maps lining the command center walls showed black markings indicating operations that had to be aborted due to exposure caused by the captured agents' compelled confessions. The interrogations of Otto and Ingrid had revealed to the Americans not only details of specific operations, but also information about training, financing, and organizational structure, intel that would allow them to identify and neutralize similar networks in other countries. Most alarming to Berlin was the discovery that the Americans had managed to break codes the Abwehr considered mathematically impossible to decipher, indicating technological advances that placed German intelligence at a permanent strategic disadvantage. The international prestige of German espionage, built over decades of successful operations, suffered irreparable damage that would affect agent recruitment, cooperation with allied countries, and the trust of human sources in enemy territory. The spring of 1943 brought not only the thawing of New York's streets, but also the blossoming of a new era in intelligence warfare, with Operation Countertide studied as a dividing line between traditional methods and modern counter-espionage techniques. Birds singing in the city's parks provided an ironic counterpoint to the echoes of a victory, reverberating through the corridors of power in Washington, London, Moscow, and all capitals where intelligence professionals grasped the strategic implications of what had occurred on American soil. The scent of blooming flowers mingled with the persistent aroma of classified documents still circulating among government departments, each page adding detail on how 2 German spies had been turned, unintentionally, into teachers, offering Americans valuable lessons about vulnerabilities in modern intelligence operations. The soft texture of the spring breeze brushing New Yorkers' faces contrasted with the harsh realities Otto and Ingrid faced in their cells, where they gradually understood that they had taken part not only in an espionage operation, but in a silent revolution that would forever change the rules of the international intelligence game. Their capture marked the end of an era of German confidence in technical superiority and the beginning of decades of American dominance in counter-espionage arts that would define the balance of power during the inexorably approaching Cold War. A successful counter-espionage operation doesn't just capture spies, it captures secrets, methods, and most importantly, the confidence the adversary had in its own superiority. The summer of 1945 arrived in New York, carrying winds that whispered stories of victory and defeat, as the war in Europe came to an end, and the world began to grasp the true scope of secret operations fought in the shadows beyond the official battlefields. Richard Callahan, now promoted to Assistant Director of Counter-Espionage, watched the movement of ships in the harbor from the window of his new office on the 30th floor, knowing that many of those convoys had sailed safely thanks to the false information Otto and Ingrid had unwittingly transmitted to Berlin during months of controlled surveillance. The scent of victory that permeated the city's air, mingled with the familiar aroma of strong coffee and carbon paper that still defined his professional routine, now joined by the added satisfaction of having taken part in a silent revolution in the art of modern warfare. His experienced hands leafed through the final report of Operation Countertide, a 400-page document that would be studied for decades in intelligence academies around the world as a perfect example of how to turn an enemy's confidence into his own destruction. The smooth texture of the bound pages contrasted with the rough memories of sleepless nights, constant tension, and psychological pressure that had marked the 2 most intense years of his professional life. The distant sound of celebratory sirens echoing through the city streets created an appropriate soundtrack for the closing of a historic chapter in which espionage and counter-espionage had reached levels of sophistication that would redefine future conflicts. Callahan knew the success of his operation had set precedents that would influence American national security strategy for generations, transforming a tactical victory into a lasting strategic advantage. Otto Kramer was completing his 3rd year in prison, with the bitter resignation of a man who had understood not only the magnitude of his defeat, but also the brilliance of the operation that had turned him from hunter into prey through methods he still could not fully comprehend. The metallic clang of doors locking continued to echo through the federal prison's corridors, but now it had become the familiar soundtrack of a life reduced to the physical limits of a cell and the psychological limits of a mind, trying to process the most complete professional failure a spy could endure. The smell of industrial disinfectant that permanently hung in the prison air had replaced the sense of tobacco and metal from the transmission equipment that had once defined his identity during years of service to the German Abwehr. His hands, which had once operated secret codes with the skill of an artist, now performed simple manual tasks in the prison workshop, feeling the rough texture of industrial materials that constantly reminded him of the distance between his professional past and his institutionalized present. Otto had become an involuntary legend among other prisoners, who knew distorted fragments of his story as a German spy captured in a cinematic operation that had become a benchmark of American counter-espionage efficiency. During long, sleepless nights, he listened to the distant traffic of New York and imagined the radio waves still crossing the city, carrying secrets between adversaries who had learned valuable lessons through his own defeat. The letters from his family in Germany stopped arriving completely after the war's end, signaling that he had been officially forgotten by a country that could never publicly acknowledge the existence of operations that had ended in such spectacular failure. Ingrid Weiss discovered that prison had paradoxically become a place of deep reflection, where she could question not only the operational methods she had mastered, but also the personal values and national loyalties that had defined decades of her life. The sound of women's voices conversing in the corridors created an atmosphere of forced community that stood in dramatic contrast to the calculated solitude of her earlier life as a spy operating under false identities in enemy territory. Her delicate hands, which once decoded secret messages intended to influence the course of a world war, now worked on embroidery and craft projects that prison administration deemed appropriate for the rehabilitation of women convicted of crimes against national security. The smell of industrial soap and simple food had replaced the French perfumes and champagne of the social events where she had once gathered vital information, creating an olfactory reality that symbolized the complete transformation of her existence. The rough texture of prison uniforms brushed against her skin as a constant reminder that the carefully constructed identity she had worn had been dissolved by American professionals who knew every aspect of her false persona better than she did. Ingrid began to write fragmentary memoirs of her experience as a spy, not for publication, but as a way to process psychologically the magnitude of her defeat and to understand how she had been so completely manipulated by adversaries who demonstrated absolute superiority in the arts she had believed herself to master. Other inmates sought her out to hear stories of international espionage, but she discovered that speaking her experiences aloud only made more evident the extent of her professional naivety and personal vulnerability in the face of American techniques that had anticipated her every move during months of secret operations. The end of World War II brought revelations that turned Operation Countertide into a mandatory case study for Allied intelligence services, which discovered in it critical details of how a single counter-espionage operation had provided vital strategic information about German capabilities across multiple operational areas. The sounds of celebration in New York streets echoed through the windows of the Federal Building, where analysts worked intensely to catalog and distribute the lessons learned from the capture and interrogation of the German spies. The smell of documents being processed in bulk mixed with the aroma of strong coffee that fueled work sessions, stretching through entire nights, as specialists extracted every fragment of useful intelligence from years of systematic interrogations. The smooth texture of the final reports being distributed to partner agencies contrasted with the harsh operational realities Otto and Ingrid had faced, turning brutal human experiences into strategic data that would influence national security policies for decades. Techniques developed during the operation were incorporated into the training curricula for American agents and shared with British, French, and other Allied intelligence services, which recognized the sophistication of the methods used to turn enemy spies into involuntary sources of intelligence about their own organizations. The capture of Otto and Ingrid had revealed not only information about specific operations, but also detailed data about organizational structures, training methods, communication techniques, and psychological vulnerabilities that characterized the German espionage system as a whole. The prolonged interrogations produced counter-espionage manuals that would be used during the coming Cold War, when Americans and Soviets alike would apply the lessons learned in New York to identify and neutralize espionage networks operating in their respective territories. The 1950s found Otto and Ingrid facing different realities of their prison sentences. He remained institutionalized due to the gravity of his wartime activities, while she was gradually moved into rehabilitation programs that would eventually lead to her deportation to a divided Germany. that no longer recognized the values for which she had once fought. The sound of trains crossing the country carried other former prisoners of war back to their homelands, but Otto remained on American soil as a living example that certain betrayals against national security bring permanent consequences that transcend armistices and peace treaties. His prison routines had become mechanical and predictable, punctuated only by occasional letters from academic researchers interested in studying the psychological aspects of his experience as a spy captured in a counter-espionage operation that had become legendary among intelligence professionals. The familiar smell of disinfectant and concrete in his prison contrasted with the increasingly distant memories of the scents of tobacco and metal that had characterized his years as an active member of the German espionage elite. The rough texture of his cell walls had become as familiar as the skin of his own hands, a constant reminder that some defeats are so complete they permanently redefine the existence of those who endure them. Ingrid, meanwhile, discovered that conditional freedom in a devastated and divided Germany presented challenges no less complex, where her reputation as a captured spy made her simultaneously suspect to authorities on both sides of the Iron Curtain descending over Europe. Her skills in cryptography and intelligence analysis lay dormant for decades, as no government or private organization was willing to employ someone whose professional competence had been so publicly discredited through a capture that symbolized American technical superiority over German espionage methods. The legacy of Operation Countertide transcended the individual lives of Otto and Ingrid to become a historical landmark that redefined international standards of intelligence warfare and established precedents that would influence future conflicts throughout the decades of the Cold War that rose from the ashes of World War II. The sound of air raid sirens that had once echoed over Berlin was replaced by the constant hum of electronic monitoring equipment that would characterize the new era of technological surveillance inaugurated by American successes in counter-espionage. Richard Callahan, now recognized internationally as an authority in infiltration techniques and the manipulation of enemy networks, spent his final years in service establishing training programs that turned the methods developed during the capture of the German spies into official doctrine for future generations of American agents. The smell of classified documents continued to permeate his office until his retirement, now carrying the added scent of victories that had saved American lives and shortened a war that might have dragged on for years without the intelligence gained from the operation that defined his career. The smooth texture of the training manuals he developed contrasted with the rough memories of constant tension and sleepless nights that marked the most intense months of an operation that turned two confident German spies into unwitting teachers, imparting to Americans lessons about vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future conflicts. His techniques of strategic patience and prolonged observation became essential components of the CIA's curriculum when the agency was created in the post-war era, ensuring that the legacy of Operation Countertide would continue to influence American intelligence operations during decades of ideological confrontation with the Soviet Union. The Brooklyn Heights apartment where Otto and Ingrid had run their spy network was transformed into a secret museum within the FBI's training facilities, where generations of agents would study every detail of how excessive confidence can be turned into fatal vulnerability through methods demonstrating absolute technical and strategic superiority over adversaries who underestimated American capabilities. The true triumph of an intelligence operation is measured not only by the lives it saves or the secrets it uncovers, but by how it turns an enemy's defeat into lasting victories that echo through future generations, teaching that in the silent war between nations, strategic patience always outmatches tactical arrogance, and spies who believe they are deceiving their adversaries often discover they were themselves deceived from the very first move in a game whose rules they never truly understood.